Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In this episode of Ahrefs podcast, we're going to unpack the growth tactics of Gong, a massively popular revenue intelligence platform, which I'm sure you've heard about once or twice. And my guest is Udi Ledergor, who joined Gong back in 2016 and helped the company grow to over 300 million in annual revenue, last publicly recorded mention. He first joined as their VP of Marketing, then CMO, and now Chief Evangelist. And Udi recently published a book called Courageous Marketing. I have it here with me. I actually finished this book in pretty much a weekend because it's quite a riveting read. I enjoyed it a lot. And ever since I've read his book, I was dying to speak to Udi and kind of dive into all the stories and marketing lessons that he shared in this book. So here we are. Udi, welcome to Ahrefs podcast.
Hi, Tim. Thanks so much for having me. And thank you, everyone who's joining us today.
Udi, so I want to start kind of from the early days of Gong. And in one question, I kind of want to ask you two questions. First, how did you think of marketing when you just joined? Like, which channels and strategies did you focus on? And how that changed today? Was there a massive change between like the kind of the marketing framework that you started for Gong and how it looks today?
Yes. So I would zoom out and say my first question was not about channels. It was more about what am I trying to accomplish? And when I joined Gong, just for context, I was employee number 13 and marketer number 1. So there was literally 0 followers on our LinkedIn page, if it existed. I had no traffic on the website. We had 11 paying customers. So very few people knew about Gong. My goal at the time was to create awareness. I wanted people to know that we exist and what we do and why it's important and how we can help. So that was my starting point. And the reason I start with that is because it's very, very important because every few years, the big goal that marketing needs to achieve changes. For context, after that stage, and I'll get back to your question on channels, but after a couple of years, when more people knew about us, I wanted them to understand more about the value of using the product. They heard about a company called Gong because we've been doing all these crazy marketing stunts, but not everyone knew what we actually do and why it's important. Today, our goal has changed again because now we're in a very fortunate position and we have market domination and lots of companies and people know about Gong. Now it's really important to tell the story that we've evolved from revenue intelligence that you mentioned to the AI operating system for revenue teams. And what does that mean? It's not just about call recording and analysis anymore. It's about managing the day-to-day of revenue teams everywhere. So depending on the goal of marketing, from there, I would start blueprinting what do I need to achieve and which channels and tactics I want to use. So to go back to your original question, as I promised, in the early days, I thought, okay, one principle I'm going to use is to find what I call, where is the party? Where are people congregating both in real life, or as my kids would say, IRL, and online? Where are they congregating? Because it's way easier to go to where the party is at, a party that someone else is organizing or is self-organizing, and show up and start meeting people and telling them what you do, and then maybe bring them back to your place or your website and your assets. I think in contrast, a mistake that some marketers have made, I probably made it in the past as well, is overly investing in the early days in your website as if you have any traffic and somebody cares. But if I didn't have any traffic, I remember my CEO coming to me and say, Udi, this is our ugly website. Please do something with it. And I said, I'm not touching it in the next 6 months. He said, why? It's terrible. I said, because nobody's coming to the website anyway. I want to focus on getting leads and meetings because that's what my CEO wanted in the early days. You want MQLs, you want SQLs. I'm not going to get them from the website right now because literally nobody's there. So what did we do? In the offline world, nothing too crazy. I mapped out all the conferences for salespeople that were happening at the time. It was a very different landscape. Again, I've been at Gong for 10 years now. So since 2016, there were many conferences, some of them organized by companies who have since become partners and then competitors, other larger industry conferences like Dreamforce and others. And we had to start choosing based on the demographics. I talked to all the organizers and I had to look at the demographics and decide where does it make sense to show up and how should we show up. Some conferences, it made sense to be a speaker. Some conferences, it made sense to have a booth. Other conferences, it made more sense to just hijack their traffic by doing either some side event or some cheeky advertising campaign outside of the main conference. For example, Dreamforce is a conference that in the 10 years of Gong history, we've never officially sponsored because we want some of that audience, but it's very expensive. And we found much better ways of hijacking that traffic. So that was kind of the approach for the real world or offline world. Online, I didn't know where sales leaders hung out back then. So we started experimenting with very, very, very small budgets and mostly organic content, which we'll probably get back to. We started experimenting on Twitter, now X. We experimented with YouTube. I remember experimenting with Facebook, which was very popular 10 years ago, and also LinkedIn. And a few months into this experiment, we found that the majority of sales leaders that we're going after actually live on LinkedIn. And so we very quickly made the decision to optimize all of our content for LinkedIn because that's where they're at, and then just repurpose it on some of the other platforms. And eventually we kind of killed Facebook and even YouTube at the time. It was years until we got back to YouTube when they became a more prominent business tool. But so to make a long story short, LinkedIn was our very successful first organic social channel. And we used an email list that we started building pretty rapidly. And the secret to the success of those two channels was our organic content, which we can talk about later if you want to. But the point there is that we couldn't afford to be boring. I couldn't outspend large CRM companies in the space. I still can't outspend Salesforce or Microsoft or Oracle or any of these companies. So I had to be more creative. I had to do something to stand out. And that's where our whole content strategy came into play.
Yeah, I like your take on creativity. Since you mentioned it, let's quickly do a detour there. So it might be a direct quote. I don't know because I have so many notes when studying your previous podcast interviews and some of your LinkedIn content. You might have said that best practices are shit. I'm not sure.
That sounds like something I would say.
Okay, great. So yeah, your point is that when you're following best practices, you're doing the same thing that everyone else does, which by definition doesn't make you stand out. And you need to stand out, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but also something I really enjoyed you saying about the creativity is that creativity is kind of a cheap way to get distribution, because if you're doing something smart, something witty, people would naturally share it and they would naturally engage with it more. So you don't need to spend more budget because you're being creative. So kind of the first question, yeah, creativity is good and all. How do you become creative? How do you foster creativity? Like, how does it work?
Okay. I love the question, Tim. So first, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants way bigger and smarter than me. I learned what I learned about what I know about being creative and standing out and creating something that people will want to engage with and share from 40-year-old books. If you go to Robert Cialdini's Influence, which he wrote in the 1980s, originally it was a flop. Like, nobody bought it. He was almost ready to move on. And then suddenly it caught a following and then it exploded, and it's still been in print for the last 40-something years. I have his signed copy behind me, which I'm very proud of. It's an amazing book that talks about the basic of human psychology as it relates to persuasion. The subtitle of the book, Influence, is The 6 Pillars of Human Persuasion. And he talks about what makes us do something that someone else wants us to do, whether it's an advertiser or a politician. And the examples he gives obviously are now very outdated, but they're very, very relevant because the basic principles haven't changed. We still listen and want to follow people of authority. So authority is one of his pillars. We still listen and want to follow people we like. Likability is one of his principles. But the first one, which sounds so obvious when you break it down, but it's not, is reciprocity, which is a big word for saying give before you take. And when you think about some of the best marketing campaigns, they first give value, they create value to their audience, and much, much later, they ask for something that seems very small in return. Like, I've been giving you content that you've been reading for the last 2 months. Maybe give me your email and I can start sending this great content that you're reading anyway to your inbox. That's a great use, modern use of reciprocity. So I would start with just reading there and seeing what makes humans tick, right? So that's number one. Many years later, Chip and Dan Heath wrote the book Made to Stick, which started talking about social media and YouTube and really broke down with a really data-driven approach what makes people share something. Because everyone goes to their agency or social media marketer and says, make this go viral, which of course is a cliche now. And you can't really engineer viral. But if you understand and study the examples of which things tend to go viral and which things will never go viral, you get a much better idea of, even if your posts don't go viral, they might actually do well. And when you start doing this on a regular basis, maybe every week, maybe a couple of times a week, you get a lot more engagement, a lot more traffic. So the Heath brothers talked about why people share stuff. And some of the best lessons I learned there are, okay, you can't write a press release about your company and version 2.6-8 you just released and expect people to make it go viral because it's exciting to your CEO. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. You have to create something that people actually care about. And what would people share or show off? Something that makes them look smart, something that makes them look cool, something that makes them look like they're in some secret society and they're in an insider circle and they know what's happening before other people. Those are the type of things that you learn from these books. And again, these are decades old books, but they read as fresh as if they were written yesterday. So I would urge any marketer on that journey trying to answer the question you posed to me, Tim. How do you manufacture creativity? And in this case, we're not in the arts. And one way I like to describe marketing is creativity in service of capitalism. I'm sure that rubs some people in the wrong way, but I truly believe that's what we're doing. We're not being creative to create a Picasso to hang on the wall. We're being creative to drive more leads, more meetings, brand awareness, demand generation, all that fun stuff that we get paid for, right? That's why they pay us the big bucks. So how do you engineer that sort of creativity? Start with the basic principles of influence. Maybe read the Heath brothers' Made to Stick to understand what are going to make people share. And then, of course, you might end up reading Courageous Marketing, where I really break down the tactics of how to do that in your emails, in your social media, in your content strategy, in your event experiences, in building a category, etc.
Okay, so I asked you a question about creativity in marketing, and you answered with studying the first principles of marketing, which are essentially first principles of psychology, persuasion, because Robert Cialdini's book is among the top 5 books I typically recommend to anyone who's asking me, Tim, like, how do I learn marketing? How do I get better marketing? That's for sure. Alongside with Jonah Berger, Contagious, alongside with Made to Stick. These books, alongside with Malcolm Gladwell, Tipping Point, he also shared a lot of interesting things.
I just read his latest book, The Revenge of the Tipping Point, that just came out a few months ago.
Oh, wow. I didn't know about that.
I've read every single book he's ever written. He's a fascinating writer. I've also had the privilege of hearing him speak a couple of times live on stage. He's as good a speaker as he is a writer.
Oh, wow.
Which is almost annoying.
By the way,
nobody should have so much talent.
Just a quick question. Your book has actually blurb from Robert Cialdini.
It does.
How did you get this?
I cold emailed him with a persuasive email.
Wow.
How ironic is that?
So you don't have like a long history with Robert Cialdini. You just cold emailed him with your book. And he was happy to.
Cold email with a little asterisk. I never met him in person to this day.
Yeah.
The very short history that I have with him, or it's not even history with him, but the context that I had is someone on my team, a couple of levels below me, a few years ago, hired him during COVID to speak at one of our virtual events. So we went virtual like many companies during COVID, and we wanted to draw people to our virtual events. And one of the ways to do that is not to talk about our latest product release, but to bring a celebrity speaker that people actually want to listen to. So we hired him to speak from his home at our virtual event. And again, many years after that, probably 4 or 5 years later, I remembered that context. And when I reached out to him, I made it a very short, very personal email that talked about how huge a fan I am, and of course read his book and follow it religiously every day. And then I also mentioned the context of hiring him at my company. Again, it was not me, it was someone twice removed. And within like 2 days, he responded to my email. And I was, doing like this, trying kind of scratching my head, like he actually responded. So he was the first celebrity blurb that I got.
Yeah, I also think you're giving him quite a few mentions of his book in your book, which is like a typical way to kind of ego bait a person, so to say, kind of a colloquial term in marketing.
But he had to read the book to actually know that. But yes, you're right. So he did read the book, and he was happy to offer me a blurb, which I'm eternally grateful for. I mention a lot of celebrity authors in my book. Not all of them responded to my request for a blurb. Some of them responded, but had to decline because of timing reasons. Seth Godin and I had a really funny email exchange about his timing and schedule and why he can't help. Adam Grant and I had a very nice email exchange, but they didn't end up blurbing the book. Fortunately, I got some incredible names like Robert Cialdini, Daniel H. Pink, Nir Eyal, all of them #1 best-selling authors who were very generous in giving me their blurbs.
Wow. Let me go back to my original question about kind of the channels, the strategy, or maybe even, I know, marketing philosophy, so to say. So you mentioned events. You said that from the early days you were investing in the events. You were figuring out where the salespeople are hanging out, and you were establishing your presence there so that people would learn what Gong is. You also did a fair share of advertising. Again, as I learned from your book, you famously had 2 Super Bowl ads, and you're sharing in the book how you made them for like a fraction of the budget, which I found very interesting. I didn't know this, so thanks for sharing. Awesome. Very cool. You also shared that you had a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal, also kind of regional, the West Coast edition or something. Still, even regional, with your hacks of kind of doing this for a smaller budget. Oh, I also remember you were sponsoring or got your CEO to some like big podcast, which also costs a
Michael
lot of money.
Lewis podcast, author of Moneyball and The Big Short.
Yes. Yeah. So those things kind of add up. So yeah, we're not talking about like millions and millions in budget, but those things add up. And back in the day, you were like a reasonably small podcast, small startup, under like $30 million in revenue. So how did you think about marketing budget back in the days? Because you were getting like investments from funds, etc. You were like a venture-backed company, and you had to spend a portion of that money on marketing, and specifically advertising can just be like a sink for marketing budget easily. You can throw money at advertising indefinitely. So how did you think of your marketing budget back in the day?
So to clarify, just so we don't lose all our listeners now, because they're probably thinking, oh, I'm never going to have Super Bowl budget. Who is this guy? Why did you bring him on? All the examples that you gave, Super Bowl commercial, Michael Lewis podcast, and the other big, like Wall Street Journal, all of these happened in my 5th, 6th, and 7th year at Gong. None of these things happened in my first 3 years. I joined Gong in 2016. My first Super Bowl ad was in 2021. The Wall Street Journal ad was probably in 2020. And Michael Lewis podcast, I think, was also either 2019 or 2020. All these were later stage tactics that, despite having figured out how to pull them off at a fraction of what they usually cost, I did not have even that fraction of a budget in my first 3 or 4 years of Gong. So I wanted to clarify, like all those things came in year 4, 5, etc. Now, to go back to your question, so what did I do and what worked in the early days? It goes back to what I said about I couldn't afford to be boring. And so we started thinking, what content could we create? I'm a huge believer in content marketing, and I've used it before at previous companies as the backbone of my demand gen strategy. Because the beautiful thing about content marketing is that it costs almost nothing to create. And there are actually some beautiful ways of distributing it that cost almost nothing. All you need is a creative brain and put in some work. And if you look at the big companies that at that point are outsourcing everything to agencies that are running campaigns for 20 companies, they're not getting that type of creativity and effectivity from their content. They can afford to be boring. They're just throwing money at the problem. I couldn't afford to be boring. And so we started looking around, and I thought, okay, does the world need another book about sales? And I searched Amazon. The Amazon search taps out at 100,000 results. So there were over 100,000 books about sales. So you would think, no, the world doesn't need another book about sales. But I thought, unless we could do something that hasn't been done before. And looking and reading many of the popular sales books, I realized that most of the sales books were written by smart, accomplished people that went through an experience, like Aaron, who built the first SDR team at Salesforce. He wrote a great book, Predictable Revenue, that became hugely popular for many years, about how to build an SDR team that was very successful. You look at other books, it's people who were carrying bags selling at Xerox or IBM, and they wrote about their experience, and there's some really good lessons there, but they're built mostly on anecdote and personal experience. And we couldn't find, in the search that we did in 2016, now there are books like this, but we couldn't find books that gave you data and in a data-driven approach said, here's what works and doesn't work in sales. Here's how you should open a sales call. Here's how you should talk about your competitor. Here's how you talk about pricing. Here's how you ask different questions when you're talking to an executive or when you're talking to a lower level leader. And we thought, well, that sounds like something that salespeople and sales leaders would find really, really valuable. Now, remember, at this point, Gong has 11 customers. But fortunately, those 11 customers already recorded a few thousand calls and put them into Gong. I think when I arrived, we already uploaded about 20,000 calls from customers into Gong. And we had the thought, well, even though we can't show them a lot of insights in the product yet, on the back end, we can use a data analyst and go through the data, do some mining, find some really interesting things that salespeople would find interesting. So we did that. And we started publishing blog posts. We created a content series that we called Gong Labs. It was literally created in our labs. It was a part-time data analyst that got a dump of our customers' calls once a quarter. And I asked him questions. I asked him, like, what's the best way to open a cold call? And then he looked at the data and saw that people who start a call by saying, how have you been, get to keep the buyer on the line much longer than people who ask, how are you, or start apologizing. I know you're busy, blah, 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 blah. So we started publishing these insights, and a lot of them went against the popular opinion. Of course, maybe the most famous example we've ever done was in 21. We published the research showing that salespeople who swear and curse on their sales call have up to 8% higher win rates. And the internet exploded when we did that. We earned a lot of media for that. Again, it didn't cost us anything, but fastcompany.com ran with the story. You can't buy that. They have to really like your story. As soon as they went live, radio stations started calling me from Canada and other places to interview me about this incredible story they just read. So that exploded in the best way possible. And it's because we used our exclusive data. It was virtually impossible for people to get elsewhere to create really exciting stories that they cared about. They provided value to them. So as you can imagine, a lot of the people commenting on social media and sharing it used very colorful vocabulary, I'll put it that way, to share how excited they are that they got this permission to use this type of vocabulary and curse on their sales calls. And then there was a small but important group of people that commented how appalled they were and shocked that we were suggesting that they use this type of language in a professional setting. And that is a marketer's dream. You want to create a discussion. You want people on both sides arguing You want something that's sometimes polarizing, that's controversial. That's what creates a discussion. And I think in this day and age, there's so many marketers that try to avoid conflict and they try to please everyone. And the result is you create something that's so agreeable that you're not offending anyone, but you're also not exciting anyone. And nobody talks about it. Nobody shares it because it's kind of obvious.
Yeah. And this is what algorithms reward. If people disagree with each other and have long debates, this is what algorithms want to see. So they reward this kind of content. And actually, like as I was reading the book, I saw many parallels in how you were doing marketing at Gong and how we were doing marketing at Ahrefs. And data-driven content is also one of my pillars for successful content marketing. Because, when you have, and nearly every business, if not every business, has some proprietary data that they can use from their customers that they can use to create content. Like if you're a dentist, you can easily study like what's the number one thing that brings people to your dentist consultancy. Is it like teeth cleaning or whatever? And you can share that, and you can also give your opinion on how to prevent it so that then you would come to them with some bigger problems or something. So every company essentially has some proprietary data from working with the customers that you can study, package, and give insights to the world. And the way that people react to data-driven content, which is not just an opinion or like someone's idea, but something that actually studied, and there's a number you can put on it, people absolutely love it. But I want to bring you back to the question about the marketing budget, because it's a very cool caveat that you said about all these advertising stunts that you did them like 5 years into
Much
growing
later,
Gong. But again, how did you approach your marketing budget going forward? Because again, one of the reasons why I'm asking is because at Ahrefs, we don't even have the marketing budget. And recently, I saw a post by Alina from Chili Piper, who said that she saw a benchmark that for a healthily growing tech company, the marketing budget should be anywhere between 6 to 10% of the annual revenue. I calculated our marketing budget for the first time in 10 years that I've been with the company, and it landed at around 5%. So even lower than the lowest benchmark. So are you like in those 10 years that you've been with Gong? And again, you probably had to set a marketing budget every year because you have investors, because you have those money you need to spend on growth, because you have certain goals. So how did you think of a marketing budget? How and then it would answer the question why in the early days you didn't go like full in on Super Bowl ads, but could only afford it like 5 years in.
So on budget, and look, I've had this conversation with my CFO and my CEO many times. Benchmarks on budget are very difficult to compare because every company has a different story and a different stage. Generally speaking, you can imagine that if I join a company with 11 customers and a low 6-figure income, my marketing budget is going to be probably a couple of times what our revenues are. But over the years, as revenue climbs, the marketing budget continues to climb in absolute numbers, but gets lower in a percentage. So you want to be careful on which comparisons you're making, because if you're looking at a company at a very early stage and they say, oh, we have 100% of revenue goes to marketing. Okay, that's because they have 50,000 in revenue. You might have $1 million in marketing, but that's just 2% of revenue. So you have to be careful with comparing apples to apples. It's tricky. And I would say to make it further complicated, if you're in consumer marketing, you probably need a much higher percentage to reach consumer. Classic enterprise software sales, you probably need lower. If you're in a marketplace where you essentially are marketing to two different audiences, imagine Uber. They're marketing both to drivers and to passengers. They need more marketing budget than both my previous examples. So it gets very complicated. And then if you're a PLG, a product-led growth, maybe you can make do with almost no marketing budget because the product is promoting itself. So these things are complicated to compare. And I would take any percentages that Alina, which I love, and anyone else is writing with a huge grain of salt and ask these questions. What is their business model? What stage of growth are they? Like, what are the real comps that I'm looking at. Maybe that's the budget that they're talking about is just programs, but not payroll. But what if they have lots of people working with a small budget? That costs a lot of money too. So it's lots of questions that I'd want to get answered before I make those comparisons. And my CFO definitely gave me a hard time every time I came with comps from other companies. He said, yes, but, and annoyingly, he was usually right. So to answer your question, how I thought about budget, well, I've been very fortunate to work with the CEO for the last 10 years. And fun fact, Amit Bendov, Gong CEO and co-founder, and I have worked together at 3 different companies now. The first time was 28 years ago, if you can believe that.
Wow.
Neither of us was a teenager, but we've been working together since the 1990s. So we went through the dot-com bubble burst together at a company called Click Software. And 10 years later, we worked together very closely at a company called Panaya. And several years later, he called me and asked me to come help at Gong. So we know each other very well, and our approaches to marketing are on many topics are well aligned. And here's his approach in a nutshell. And don't take this too literally, but take it seriously. He says, look, the marketing budget is unlimited. Take some budget, show me the ROI on what you're doing. If it's bringing in more revenue, you can keep doing more of it as much as you want. And that makes sense. And he would explain that to the board as well, right? Imagine I take $1 million and I turn them into $5 million in revenue or $10 million in pipeline. Who wouldn't want me to do more of that? And since I'm helping create money, I also get more money. So that is the general approach. But that requires a certain thinking about marketing as driving revenue and not as a cost center. Marketing is not IT or legal or whatever. I don't want to get in trouble with other departments, but there are cost centers right? You need furniture. You need to pay for rental for offices. That is a cost center. It doesn't directly create revenue, but marketing, when done right, creates revenue. And so why would you limit it artificially if marketing can prove that with more budget, it can create more revenue? So that was the approach. Now, of course, I started each year with a number because like every company, our CEO and then CFO had to approve with the board a number. So the way we did this, we usually start with the company goals. What are the strategic goals? And one of those is going to be revenue. So what are we trying to achieve next year in terms of pipeline and revenue? And then we break that down very meticulously to what's going to come from inbound marketing, what's going to come from self-sourced AEs, what's going to come from SDRs, and at some point, what's going to come from partners. And then we start in marketing building the programs. Okay, if I need to create $1 million of inbound revenue, what does that look like? What are my website conversion rates? How much can I expect from events and from content and from paid and from social and all this? And then we start putting numbers on all of that, and we arrive at a number, and then we go arm wrestle the CFO because as my CFO shared with me once, he said, Udi, if I gave every C-level exec the original budget that they came to ask for, we would be spending 3 times the amount that the board approved for our plan. And that's pretty consistent. So obviously we all arm wrestle and we settle on what we get, but if we do the work right, the magic works.
I really like the idea that the marketing budget is essentially unlimited as long as you can prove that it is bringing more than what you're spending. The only problem is marketing attribution, which is a nightmare and essentially unsolvable problem. Because again, when you create this piece of content about salespeople swearing and it improving the close rates, and then you get all these interview requests from radio stations, as you say, how do you track the value of that?
It does not show up on any neat dashboard. It does not.
And with all the advertising, there's a famous saying. I know that out of every $2 I spent on advertising, 1 is wasted. The problem is I don't know which one. So yeah, it's very hard. And what I'm seeing today, you're saying that you only sponsored Super Bowl and Wall Street Journal in year 5, but I was recently interviewing the head of marketing at Gamma, and what is that? This is their first year or something, and they already did an ad on Las Vegas Sphere, which is also quite costly. They also had like some trick that they played it only for like a very limited period of time. but still that is very costly. So those new AI startups, they're kind of redefining the playbook because they're just going all in, like all or bust, and they are investing incredible amounts of money into their
Yeah,
advertising.
there's some companies doing really inspiring stuff. I remember a couple of years ago in 2022, Coinbase, that was relatively unknown, they bought 5 seconds of a Super Bowl commercial and they just showed a floating QR code. And
Yeah.
reportedly, they still got like 30 million hits or something crazy like that. So if you're creative, borderline brilliant like that, you can make 5 seconds count for a lot. Not many people can pull
Did you
that
see
off.
what they did this year?
Yes. I did. Again, things are changing. I think one of the funny things I think this year, if you look at there's never been more AI companies advertising on Super Bowl than this year. I personally really liked Anthropic's campaign. I think it was really well done. I think the ironic and interesting thing, though, is if you look at those campaigns of AI companies, at least the ones I've seen, they were all human actors, human cameras, human directors. They were not created by AI. And that tells us something about those first principles that we talked about from Cialdini and the Heath brothers and everyone else. We still want to connect and see a human pair of eyes in front of us, and we want to hear a human voice, and we want to know there's a human brain behind a lot of the things that we engage with.
Yeah, we're about to talk about AI, of course. We cannot avoid this topic.
I've heard of it.
So just to give people some context, what Coinbase did for this Super Bowl, they showed kind of a karaoke of Backstreet Boys song where you had to kind of sing along and follow. And it ended very strangely. The last phrase was Coinbase, which was kind of strange. But people loved it. It was discussed on Twitter, on X. So yeah, quite creative.
Not a good creative.
Speaking of content marketing, because you talked about Gong Labs, you talked about creating a lot of content. I want to segue a little bit into my bread and butter, which is SEO and now AEO. I want to get your thoughts on how you think of search, essentially, because right now it is search. There's Google, there's ChatGPT. It is all search. How do you approach that at Gong?
So first, disclaimer, as you and probably some others know, for the last couple of years, I've been Chief Evangelist at Gong, so I'm no longer running the entire Gong marketing team, which means I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations of our website team. However, I am trying to stay up to date both at what's happening at Gong and what's happening in the industry, so I'm talking to a lot of folks in that area, and I know it's a very, very big concern. I think the biggest concern I'm hearing from marketers who relied on their websites for attracting traffic and converting it to leads is that they're getting less traffic, they're getting less leads because people are finding the answers that they need on search engines and not continuing to the website. So the talk of the town right now in the industry is that you need to discount what we used to get from the website in terms of lead and adapt to this new world, which means it's now not about how many click-throughs you're getting from the search engines, but how much authority you can build there that will in time create direct traffic or other indirect traffic, but they're not going to come nearly as much as they did directly from the search engines. And of course, there's a whole cottage industry now of companies, technologies, consultants, and agencies that are helping marketers build what they need. And essentially, marketers are starting to think about creating a version of their website for humans like we always did, but another potentially in the future exclusive version for the robots to get them what they want to increase that domain authority and credibility. And we're probably not too far away from people letting the agentic search engines not only recommend products, but go and buy them for them and do the comparison and go all the way to purchasing. Probably not purchasing a car or a CRM that way, but for most smaller stake purchases, that future is probably not too far away. So that becomes very interesting for how you create a website that supports that goal.
Yeah. I can totally understand that now in your new role, you don't have to follow everything that happens at Gone Marketing. But yeah, as for so-called answer engine optimization, I don't think I necessarily agree with you that people would need to create websites for robots in the future, but I would put a slightly different spin on it. I would say that you want to have more information on your website than a human would be willing to consume. I would put it this way.
That
So
makes
if
sense.
someone really wants to go to your website and research everything, it should be still laid out on your pages. It should be still well written. So if a person wants to read it, yeah. But
Sure.
because right now it is so easy to use those LLM to distill huge amounts of information to answer a very specific question that you have, you want to make sure that your website is just like brimming with information, and there's like every possible thing that you want that you can say about your product and your business. You should be saying it now.
That's been true, I think. Tim, correct me if I'm wrong. That's been true for many years now. Like with some marketers interpreting it pretty naively as more is better, and just flooding their websites with pages that were clearly written for the search engines, not for humans. But I think one of the other interesting changes I'm seeing now is marketers looking at third-party sites that maybe were not so popular in the last few years, and suddenly everyone's going back to Reddit and Wikipedia and G2 reviews and other websites that are now known to be important sources for the agentic search engines, and they're making sure that their presence there is well felt. Is that what you're seeing?
Exactly. Yes. Third-party sites is kind of what is changing in SEO, because previously most marketers and most SEO professionals were focusing on their own website. How well are we ranking? Which pages of our website are ranking? Do we cover all the potential searches that people are making? But now you also want to see like how well is my brand and my business represented on other websites? How many websites are talking to me, talking about me, versus how many websites are talking about competitors? So this is becoming a very important thing. And again, speaking about marketing budgets, the shift that is happening in SEO, where you're confirming that a lot of people won't necessarily click to a website, but they would make a decision right when talking to a search engine, and it is very possible that they would actually make a purchase from there as well without visiting your website. Again, attribution is becoming even harder. So all the work that you're putting into to put this information on your website, to work with third-party websites, which is essentially marketing, it gets harder to attribute. But hopefully companies like ours would solve at least part of it with useful metrics that you can use.
Yes, I think one interesting, maybe to wrap up, if we have a minute to wrap up that part of the conversation, for marketers that still need to convince their CEO or CFO why they need to invest in third-party content and other areas of presence that they need to be at, and not just on their website anymore. There's a 10 or 15-year-old stat that has become kind of stale from Forrester that talks about buyers doing 70% of their buying journey before they talk to a vendor salesperson, which means they do most of their research off of your website. They go to review site, they go to chat groups, they go to conferences, they talk to peers, they go to social media, and they make 70% of their buying decision before they pick up the phone or fill out a lead form, because they know that as soon as they pick up the phone or fill out the lead form, the buyer is going to sit on their neck and not let them go. The vendor, is going to sit on their neck and not let them go. So they don't want to do that prematurely. And what's interesting, as I said, that stat is about 10 or 15 years old. But now with all the GEO and AEO, I've seen evidence and stats that are showing that number has grown from 70 to 83 or 85%, which means buyers are doing an increasingly larger part of their journey off of your website and before they're willing to talk to your salesperson. And that should help marketers justify why they needed to invest more in third-party presence and authority, to make sure that when the buyers are doing their own research before they talk to your salespeople, they're getting all the information that they need so that they end up wanting to talk to your salespeople.
Justifying marketing expenses and marketing investments is very different from proving the ROI of these marketing investments. I'm a big
Yes.
fan of justifying. I'm a big fan of justifying because you do it before you invest your time, money, and effort in something. While ROI, you do it afterwards. So it's
Of course.
always better to have a specific plan and understanding and common sense of why we're doing it in the first place and how it is going to work, rather than try to do something and then kind of try to hack ROI together. Oh, we got these clicks from here, we got these clicks from there. So I'm a big fan of using common sense to justify your marketing decisions.
Common sense is helpful. At some point, when the team and the budgets grow, you probably need some structure there as well. So one of the tricks that I talked about in my book is having a preemptive experiments budget, which I found very, very, very useful. For those who haven't yet read my book, Courageous Marketing, I'll maybe give a 60-second plug on it if there's interest. What I talk about there is for many, many years, I had a bank of crazy ideas and I needed to budget them somehow. So in my internal marketing team, we just called that line item Udi's Crazy Ideas. One of my team members who was responsible for communicating the budget to finance had the great idea to change that internal marketing name from Udi's Crazy Ideas to Marketing Experiments, which was a little bit easier for finance to swallow. And here's what we did. We took every year roughly 10% of our program's budget and put it in that line item of marketing experiments. I would say when the budget absolutely was small, that percentage was even higher. It was maybe 15%. As the budget got into the 8 figures, that percentage shrunk to maybe 5%, but it was still a meaningful amount of money. The two main ways that we justified that to finance, the first couple of times they called us and said, what is this marketing experiments? What money are you hiding here? And I explained, and I said, look, finance, there's 2 things you need to know. One, every demand gen channel that we're using right now is going to tap out at some point. I don't know if that's going to be in 2 weeks or in 2 years, but that is the fact of life. So I need to be experimenting with other demand gen channels so that when this starts happening, I can quickly turn up the flame on my experiments and have something else up and running. Otherwise, we're going to have a huge hole in demand gen. Nobody wants that. That's number one. And they all nod in agreement because it makes sense, right? Number 2, I say, look, we usually do budgeting, whatever your cycle is. In our case, let's say we're on fiscal as a calendar year. So we do budgeting and we need to approve the budget by October or November before the year starts. Now, there are going to be marketing opportunities that are going to present themselves in April or in June next year, and we're all going to agree that we want to take advantage of them. But if I don't budget them now in October, I'm not going to have money and I'm going to have to start a whole cycle of approving more budget. And nobody's going to enjoy that. So an example would be, some big events like Dreamforce, they're announced a year in advance. Inbound by HubSpot is announced a year in advance. Many smaller regional events that I might want to sponsor and will make sense to everyone, they're only announced 3 or 4 months before they happen. So I need to put a budget for that, for future marketing investments that we're all going to want to take advantage of that we don't know about yet because they have not made themselves visible during budgeting period. And examples of this include, I get calls from my contacts at media companies like CBS or NBC, and they'll say, or out of home networks, and they say, hey, we just had someone cancel and I can give you something for 50 or 75% off, but you need to decide next week. Now, if I had to go through a whole budget approval process, I could never pull that off. And I have very concrete examples of this that I also gave in the book. Some of my best experiments happened like this when a contact called me and said, hey, something that costs $50,000, you can have it for 12, but I need to know by Tuesday because there's a real deadline. And with my experiments budget, I could say, yes, let's do this. And it was a relatively short approval cycle. So that's one hack for maybe marketers trying to figure out how they can leave some flexibility for future experiments.
This is very cool. I think I need to reread your book because apparently there are some things from it that I don't remember, but it would be cool to revisit. Let's continue talking about artificial intelligence, and I want to talk about it in the context of some of the frameworks that you shared. And I think in the very first chapter where you are explaining your Super Bowl ad, you're sharing the concept of punching above your weight. And there you also share a very interesting strategy of where you create some like physical advertisement, and then you kind of create pictures and videos of it, and then you use that as your media to share on socials. Which is a very cool strategy. I've seen quite a few companies doing it. Again, example is Gamma, which I said they did an ad in Las Vegas Sphere. The actual ad, how many people saw it? Not many. How many people in their target audience saw it? Like maybe just like a few, a
A
dozen.
few drunk tourists on the way to the casino. Yeah, they did not do that for them.
Yeah, but the actual video of their ad on Las Vegas Sphere is something they used for their advertisements on all social media. I know in events, webinars, etc. But speaking of AI, yeah, previously we had Adobe Photoshop where you could fake anything, but now with AI it gets increasingly easier, and you don't need to go to New York Times Square and make a video of yourself with your ad at the back. You can just prompt AI and it would generate it for you, and for a lot of people it would be indistinguishable. So do you think that this kind of strategy might lose its effectiveness while being diluted by those examples? So people would read people would read your book, and they would be like, why do I need to go and do the New York Times ad and like go and take a photographer with me and take a videographer with me and create all this content while I can just prompt it and get all those videos and start advertising? So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so first, let's just acknowledge that, yes, things are changing all the time, and that's a good thing. And the best survival skill probably in any day and age, absolutely now, is to be adaptable and to not live in a cave, because things are going to change whether we like it or not. It doesn't matter whether we like it or not. If we want to survive, we need to adapt. If we want a job in a year from now, we need to adapt. But to answer your specific question, yes, you could absolutely skip Times Square billboards. Go to Nano Banana and generate a image of your face or your brand or whatever you want in Times Square. Do you think that if you have 100 employees in the company and you send that to them and say, hey, look how cool, we did a billboard in Times Square, would anyone be excited to share that with their family and their followers on social media? I don't think so, because it's obviously fake. It's obviously a waste of everyone's time, and any child can do it by just prompting Nano Banana. However, if you actually bought a billboard, which is still associated with very large advertisers, I mean, think about it. Where do Apple announce their new iPhone? Times Square. Where does Google announce a new Pixel? Times Square. Where does Netflix announce their new series? Times Square. HBO, Apple TV, all of them. Where does Broadway announce the new musicals? Times Square. That is where it happens. So that place, probably for the foreseeable future, is associated in our minds with big budget advertisers. So if you actually bought a billboard and you followed my framework to get it for maybe a few $100 or a couple of $1,000 instead of the huge budgets that you're imagining it costs, and you took a photo of that, that's something your employees would get excited about sharing. Because look, we're a maybe 100-person company, but we just did a billboard in Times Square. That is still very impressive. And if you did an actual print page in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, that is still impressive, because it's not something you would expect from a smaller company. Now, to be clear, there's a nuance here, which I go into in the book, of course, and that is to properly use my punch above your weight framework, which you briefly described very well. You have to have, it assumes that you have an online following, so that when you're sharing this, someone is listening and watching. Because if you're starting a company tomorrow morning and the first thing you do is go buy a Times Square billboard, who are you going to share that with? If you don't have a following, if nobody cares, you don't have a captive audience, then that would be a waste of money. And some companies come to me and say, hey, Udi, we're super early stage. We're trying to figure out what to do. We thought of trying your Times Square billboard. And I say, whoa, hold your horses. Like, how many followers do you have on LinkedIn? How big is your email list? What's the biggest event you're going to speak at this year? If you don't have any of these things, wait a couple of years, amass a following. Now, once you have a following, and all the examples I gave in the book assume that, maybe I didn't emphasize it strongly enough, but they assume that you have an online following, an email subscription list, many customer calls where you can showcase that Sphere Coinbase stunt or Gamma, sorry, or that Times Square billboard or that Wall Street Journal ad or the NASDAQ sign or whatever you're doing, you need a captive audience that you've already built to share that with. So like you said, nobody cares about the drunken gamblers around the Sphere. Like nobody cares about the tourists going to see Phantom of the Opera on Broadway when we do a billboard in Times Square. But I take a photo of that and some video footage and I share it with my captive audience, in my case, mostly on LinkedIn, could be in an email list, could be in sales calls, could be in a conference stage. But I need to have that audience to make that model make sense.
I would argue with you here a little bit because you don't necessarily need to have an audience if you have a large advertising budget. Because still, if you want to get your brand and product known, if you want to get it out there, you need to advertise it. And we just discussed with you how being creative and noticeable helps improve the essentially ROI of your ads. So you can have like a simple, boring banner. Oh, like we're this kind of software. We do this. I don't know, slap a cat on it or whatever, and no one would notice. Or you can take a picture of or like a video of Las Vegas Sphere. And then people who are scrolling their feed would be stopping and like, who the hell is this company who can afford to be on Las Vegas Sphere? So what I'm saying is you don't necessarily, for this punch above your weight thing, you don't necessarily need to have an audience if your advertising budget allows you to take care of distribution. So you're just creating a more effective asset for your advertising campaign with this strategy.
Yes, there are exceptions like that. I already talked about the Coinbase Super Bowl commercial of 2022 when they were not nearly as well known as they are today, but they did a very effective 5-second ad showing a bouncing QR code on the screen that millions of people couldn't resist scanning. That was brilliant, and you didn't even know who that QR code was from when you were scanning it and seeing what you're getting. So. Yeah, there are definitely exceptions, but I think fewer marketings have the problem that you're describing of, oh, I have a ton of budget and very little audience and very little customers. What do I do with all this budget? Most of us have the opposite problem of nobody knows who I am. I have a very small budget. What do I do now?
That is true. That is true. I enjoyed your argument about kind of faking this strategy with AI. Makes ton of sense. So let's continue walking through some other AI use cases. So again, we talked about the importance of creativity. So creating something interesting, something that stands out. Does AI help with this? Can you ask AI, like, come up with a creative campaign for X?
Yes, but not in the way a lot of marketers think it helps. So I want to start by stealing like an artist from my good friend Kyle Lacey, who's currently the CMO at Docebo and the head of Pavilion CMO School. Kyle had a really cool idea a few months ago that I think he stole as well, if I remember correctly. And he said, look, let's say we're getting in a room to brainstorm our next campaign idea. What do a lot of marketing teams do? They open ChatGPT or Gemini and they say, give me the top 10 ideas for this billboard I need to create. And then they look at the ideas and like, oh, well, let's circle our top 3 and focus and do one of them. That's a terrible idea because by the definition of how these agentic agents work, they're recycling things that have been done thousands, if not millions of times. It's the most obvious ideas and solutions. So the way Kyle uses it, they're going into the room, brainstorming the next campaign idea. They'll ask ChatGPT, give me the top 10 ideas for this campaign. They'll print it out and they'll take it off the table. Now nobody can suggest those 10 ideas anymore. So that is a brilliant elimination strategy. These are actually the top 10 most obvious ideas that we should not get anywhere near. But now that we've looked at these, our creative juices are flowing and our head is in that brain space, and we can start talking about the 11th and 20th and 30th idea that are a lot less obvious and might actually come into a great campaign. So I think when you realize and remember how these search engines work, it makes you look differently at how to use them. Look, sometimes you want to look for best practice. When I get in the car with my kids, I tell them to buckle up. I don't want to be creative there. I want them to do the best practice because seatbelts save lives. But if I'm trying to grab people's attention, the way to grab attention is by doing something they've never seen before, not something that they've seen a million times before. Then the best practice becomes a great elimination technique. Let's take all the top 10 or 100 things and take them off the table. So you just got to think about, what am I trying to achieve? So that's one tip I would give. And the other one is, if you understand how the AI works, you can discern between where it's helpful and where it's counterproductive. So I already gave an example of how to use it for elimination, because it's not helpful for those original ideas. But let's say we came up with the idea of doing a piece on how swearing on sales calls works. Now, once we came up with that idea that AI would never come up with in a million years because nobody has done that before. Once we came up with that idea, if we had AI today, but we wrote that piece 5 years ago, if we had AI today, we could take the original piece and ask AI to make a LinkedIn optimized version and a Facebook optimized version, and maybe even create a YouTube ad for it, and draft a press release that we could send to our press contact, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a great use of AI, because AI can work with structures and take things and make them longer and shorter and different formats and all that stuff. Same the way as designers don't need to do the manual work for taking one ad and optimizing it for 20 different platforms. That now happens within minutes, at least at the basic level. And designers can focus more on what they love doing, which is coming up with the next big creative idea. So AI helps us with productivity and many other things. I am not going to trust it to come up with my next brilliant content or campaign idea, because whatever it comes up with has already been done to death.
I love this. This is a very counterintuitive use of AI to eliminate ideas that it suggests, because they are by definition kind of statistically average and something that has been done before, rather than like taking those ideas and going with them. The next kind of segue for AI, I kind of know what you're going to say, but I still want to hear your thoughts. So one of the other frameworks that you're sharing in the book, or marketing philosophies, is to create content that people would pay for, create content worth paying for. So I anticipate that, again, AI cannot do this by definition, because any content AI can create for you is cheap content that you shouldn't have to pay for. But still, maybe you have some additional thoughts on like where, you already shared that when you have a great piece of content, you can use AI to quickly repurpose it into other formats. I completely agree with that. But a lot of companies are looking for ways to create content with AI. What do you think about this?
So I have not seen AI generated content that I would want to pay for, but maybe it's coming in the future. So I can only talk about what we're seeing now. First of all, maybe we'll take two steps back. And when B2B marketers hear my bar for quality content and I say, hey, would you pay for your content? They laugh and say, like, who's going to pay for content? But then I say, wait, do you pay for Netflix or Hulu or New York Times or Spotify or YouTube Premium? You're paying for content, right? So you agree that quality content is worth paying for. Okay. So if a good amount of your monthly budget is going on these types of content, are you holding yourself and your team to that same bar when you're creating content for others? Or is it just AI slop? Now that stops them thinking, oh, okay, that's actually an interesting idea. So that bar exists, right? Netflix is not free. New York Times is not free. People pay for that content, and we're all okay with that because we expect to pay for quality content or get constantly interrupted with ads if we're cheap. But generally speaking, we're fine with paying for content. So if you start applying that filter and that thinking to the content you and your team are creating, you'd be surprised how high you can go. Now, most B2B businesses aren't monetizing content. Gong is not monetizing content directly. We did collaborate on a few books that are actually selling, but that's not the point. But when we think about it and when we get proof that people are willing to pay for our content, that's a moment of celebration because we know we've hit that bar. And a couple of examples I can give are when we publish some of our great Gong Labs articles, we get emails from university professors who are teaching courses on sales, and they ask how much it would cost to license Gong Labs content so they can teach it in class. That's a moment of celebration on the team because we know we've written content so good that people are willing to pay for it. our answer, if you're wondering, is you can all use it for free. Just give credit and attribution to Gong. And the same goes for companies whose sales enablement team contacts us and ask, hey, I want to use your stuff for internal training because it's that good. We want to train our new salespeople and SDRs on your content. What would it cost us? Again, that's a moment of celebration. They're willing to pay for the content we created, just like Netflix, just like Spotify, just like New York Times. So it is possible. I saw a version of this the other day on LinkedIn. Someone wrote, hey, before you hit that post button, think about it. Is the post you're about to publish worth $10 to someone? Would someone pay $10 to consume that? And just stop and think for a moment. If it's not worth $10, don't post it. And I think that's a really, really good benchmark. If thinking about the big strategy is maybe too daunting for some people, just think about that one post and every post. Is it worth $10 to someone? If it makes you laugh, it's probably not going to do anything to anyone.
I don't think you need to even use those entertainment content companies like Netflix and HBO as an example, because we have Substack, and people pay to get access to kind of premium newsletters. So they literally pay to read someone's essentially article. So the content is that good that those people who are writing these articles, they have tens of thousands of people paying them, what, 10, 20, 30 bucks per month to get access to your content. That's probably an even
better example. And yeah, we all know Dave Gerhardt has a marketing community. Last time I checked, people were paying $10 a month to get access to his content, get his newsletter, and be part of a group. And yeah, that's a perfect example. People do pay for B2B content.
I know a lot of people, Emily Kramer, Kevin Indig, Kyle Poyar. There's a lot of people who are making good money on Substack, again, writing about marketing, growth, sales. So yeah, your company has to create this content for free.
That's what you're competing with. That is what you're competing with. You're competing for people's attention.
Final question before we go to the rapid fire round. I love to ask people about hiring, because creating a great team around you is, I think it's more than half of your success as a marketer, because you can only do so much alone with your ideas and your talents. So do you remember how you hired an exceptional employee to your marketing team? Like, where did that person come from?
Oh, they came from all walks of life. I found people in the most unlikely places. Not to spoil that chapter in the book for anyone who hasn't read it yet, but one of the chapters about building a courageous team talks about Vince, who I just chatted with today. When he got the call to come interview for Gong, he was working on his cousin's Filipino food truck in San Francisco, which he makes an amazing California burrito, by the way. You should go try it. Vince won't make it for you because he's working in tech since we hired him at Gong, but he had a ability to learn new things quickly, and he had a very hungry mentality for learning and doing and pleasing, that it was almost a no-brainer.
But how did you find him? Did he respond to a job opening ad or something?
No, he didn't even know that Gong existed. So one of my team members, Russell, and Vince, they both danced for the same dance company after work hours. So they were both dancers for a company literally called The Company. It's an urban dance company here in the Bay Area. They're very, very good. I've been to many of their shows. And we were putting on our first customer event, Celebrate, back in 2019. And like always, our team was understaffed for a big event like this. So Russell wanted an intern for 3 months just to help us from July to October before the event. And so he called Vince from his dance group and said, hey, do you have time to come help us? And Vince said, yeah, I'd love to help. Vince joined as an intern for 3 months. And in those 3 months, he probably made 5 times the impact that we expected him to make. And everyone liked him, so that after the big event, when he completely knocked it out of the park, Russell came to me and said, Udi, I think we should hire Vince full time for that social media role that we just opened. Vince had never worked for a tech company, never been on a marketing team, never did social media, but we hired him and it worked out pretty well. And I've got similar stories from my content managers, Devin and Chris, who never worked in marketing or content before, and they created Gong Labs and Gong Content as we know it today.
Yeah, I know Devin came from the sales team, right? He
Yes.
wanted to do some marketing, and it worked out. But to unpack this story with Vince, it was essentially a referral from an existing employee, which went into kind of like a 3 month trial. So you tested this person, and you saw that this person is great, and you hired them to the team. Very interesting. Okay, rapid fire round. I like asking about book recommendations. We went through quite a few. Robert Cialdini, Malcolm Gladwell, blah, blah, blah. But again, maybe you can think of any other, whether classic books about business, marketing, psychology, or maybe something recent that you've read. So anything you'd want to recommend.
Yeah, I gave you two. One of them is Adam Grant's, I think it's his latest book called Think Again, which is brilliant. And I refer to it also in my book because there's some really good ideas about team building there and other things. The other thing is Daniel Pink has an amazing masterclass on sales skills, which I think every person should take. He's the best-selling author of To Sell is Human and 7 total bestsellers. But I really, really enjoyed his masterclass on selling. I think everyone should take it.
Next question. Name a tech company or maybe a few whose marketing you admire.
Ooh. Oh, gosh. Right now, I think Anthropic. I already gave the example from their Super Bowl commercial. I think Anthropic is doing some really cool things right now.
You were also giving shout outs to Carta for their content marketing, so I'll help you there a little bit.
Yes, thank you. Yes, if you'd ask me about social or content, I would absolutely talk about Peter Walker. He's the head of insights at Carta, and he's doing some incredible work right now. Go follow Peter Walker. Not that he needs more followers, but go follow him on LinkedIn. I think that's a beautiful example of what you talked about earlier, Tim, of taking internal insights that almost every company has. If we had time, I'd get into that discussion as well, because there are some companies who struggle to find those insights, but Peter does not. And Carta, for those who don't know, is a company that does an equity management software, which sounds about as exciting as going to the dentist, but they actually create some amazing, interesting content that lots and lots of people follow him
for. Final question. Are you a member of any kind of marketing CMO communities or masterminds or something like that?
Probably a member of too many for me to remember. At this point in my career, I'm trying to give back. And so I show up as a mentor and coach and speaker and teacher. I teach the Pavilion CMO course that I referenced earlier that Kyle Lacey manages. I've recently spoken at the CMO huddles in Palo Alto. I've done pretty much all of them at some point or another. So yeah, I think there's a lot of great communities out there. I've spoken obviously on Dave Gerhardt's podcast a couple of times, and many others. So yeah, just find the one that gels with where you are in terms of your goals and where you are in your career. And if you want to be at in-person events, which I think we all do, find out like where do they do their events? Is it somewhere accessible for you? And join and go meet other people. Really important.
Udi, thanks a lot for this conversation. Thanks a lot for taking the time. I enjoyed this conversation the same way I enjoyed your book, and I do recommend everyone to read it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim.